An Afternoon with Artform. Welcome to An Afternoon with Artform, where our creatives, cast and crew discuss previous productions. Our podcast may contain adult content and may not be suitable for children.
Hello everyone and welcome to An Afternoon with Artform. We're doing this outside, obviously social distancing allowed, and it's a beautiful August afternoon in sunny Catford, so apologies in advance for any noise, dogs squeaking, planes going over or rustling of papers as we go through. My name's Matthew Westrip and I will be introducing everybody this afternoon, and we are going to be discussing Artform's very successful production of Into the Woods. So putting on a show is a collaborative process that starts many months before the curtain rises on opening night. And it requires input, work and time from many different areas. The director, the choreographer, the MD, the set designer, builder, lighting and sound, costumes and props, and that's before we even get anywhere near the performers themselves. So what it's hoped for is that after months of work, the result is a seamless blend of their crafts, but we seldom get to see what is behind that and get an insight into how that is achieved and how it's put on stage in the first place. So we're hoping that over the coming podcasts to shed some light on the process through stories, anecdotes, reminiscences of the productions that Artform have created over recent years. And today we're talking about Sondheim's classic fairy tale piece Into the Woods, which is a retelling of classic stories written by James Lapine and, of course, Stephen Sondheim, following a baker and his wife as they meet various fairy tale characters on their journey through the woods. It was first seen at the Old Globe Theatre in San Diego in 1986, and then subsequently going on to Broadway in 1987, where it won several Tony Awards, including Best Score and Best Book, which was at the same year that Phantom dominated the Tonys, so rather impressive to win Best Score and Best Book with the British invasion at the time. So Artform produced their production in 2015 at the Catford Broadway studio, and it was only their third production since the relaunch of the company in 2012. So here today we are very fortunate to have with us some of those people who were involved in that production. So we have Sheila Arden, who was the director of the piece. We have Chris Arden, who was one of the performers, but also I have down here set builder extraordinaire. And we have Paul Stone, who was one of the performers as well, but also a props and costumes manufacturer, effectively, with the amount that was produced for the show. And we also have Daniel Lawrence, who played Jack in the production. And welcome everyone, nice to meet you all. Do say hello.
Hello.
Lovely.
Hello.
Wonderful, lovely to see you all. So Sheila, I can honestly say it is without a doubt the best production on stage of Into the Woods I have ever seen. To be fair, it's the only production of Into the Woods I've ever seen on stage, but nonetheless, I hadn't been involved with Artform at all then, and it was a wonderful production of how you've managed to create a woodland dell inside the Broadway studio space. So what first attracted you then to undertake this fable?
Well, Artform specialising in small cast productions, the Stephen Sondheim musicals are pretty ideal for us. It's the size of cast, the fact that I think they're very flexible in interpretation. And Into the Woods was I think a favourite of mine, and one that we felt would be very popular with the audiences. So that's why we chose Into the Woods.
And what was so once you've chosen that, and then how do you come to a concept of that?
Right, so really the discussion around the concept came through the set design. Our set designer, Peter Basley, who is incredibly creative but also wants to design his set around the director's thoughts on the piece. So we had an afternoon together when he said, come on, distill this down to the core of the piece. What is it all about? And so we got down to journeys as being a huge part of it, the different characters' journeys as well as the physical journeys they made, and also the fact that they all have to make so many decisions, and the outcome of those decisions and the difficulties some of them have in making those decisions. So Peter came up with a fantastic concept of a multi-layered, multi-pathway set, which would always look as though people were travelling in different directions, meeting up in different places. And when the set eventually appeared before us in all its magnificence, and I have to say it was totally breathtaking, it achieved that in spades. It really, really did. And I think it took the audience's breath away when they saw it. I'm sure we'll go into more detail about how we did that in a minute. But I think Peter was very ambitious for the space, and it was amazing how the front of the set was started at 6 inches off the floor, and by the time you got to the back of the set, which is only 12 to 15 feet away from the front of the audience, we were at 6 feet high. So the actual scale of it was amazing, and how it fitted into the space was astonishing. So it was really good to have that as a theme to start with, and it underpinned all we did with the production after that.
Yeah, it certainly felt like that, having coming in and seeing something where, I mean, the Catford Broadway studio is about 87 seats or thereabouts, depending, give or take 1 or 2, and it felt that you were walking into a glade, effectively, of and being surrounded by it. And in fact, I seem to remember you did it when we walked in as audience members into the theatre, that it was we were going into that woodland.
You did,
woodland
yeah.
space.
There was a little glade that you walked through that was constructed from trellis work and branches and netting and all sorts of things. Yeah, so straight away you were in the woods with the characters, which is really, that's the beauty of having it in a studio space, that you can actually create it around the audience. The audience is so much more involved because they feel they're a part of it. And
I mean, talking of the size of the space, you weren't just doing this with a piano, were you, or recording? No. You were doing it with an orchestra. So
we had a 7-piece orchestra in there who were squashed into the tiniest, hottest corner of the studio, with a percussionist who was not a small gentleman, who was perched on a stool and half on top of a hot radiator, and, managed the whole week. The sound from the orchestra with our wonderful MD, Paul Harrison, was astonishing, and again raises the whole level of performance when you've got such a fantastic musical sound coming from the band. Yes.
And how do you, because obviously in terms of if you've got all those levels and everything else, how easy is it for the cast to see the conductor, the MD, effectively?
They couldn't really see him apart from out the corner of their eye occasionally, but the cast were fantastic singers and musicians, so very, very reliable. The set design itself had 14 platforms where characters could meet, 3 separate pathways. So the rehearsals themselves was like a chess game. People were told, right, you enter on pathway 1, you need to arrive at platform 14. You'll then make your way to platform 10 where you will meet so-and-so. Then down pathway 2 to platform 3 where you'll deliver that dialogue before you exit front of house, or something like that. We had the most fantastic stage manager in Lissa Jane Simpson, who actually kept the most meticulous record of all these moves. And fortunately, our rehearsal space, which is Theatre 62, have a set of platforms that they use to tier their audience for their productions. And very kindly, they let us use it for our rehearsals, and we could actually create an approximation of the levels for rehearsal. Otherwise, I don't think we'd have achieved what we did in the space, in the time.
Which, funnily enough, Chris, brings on to the question then, because I know you were very heavily involved in terms of how you built it and everything else. Where did you source all this material to?
Well, as she just said, we were very, very fortunate to have these platforms, which every single rehearsal, Lissa Jane and I and Sheila, we started about 20 minutes before everybody else just to get this set in place, because it was key critical to obviously rehearsing. During that time, we also looked at how best to actually create it in the studio. So we organised a series of steel decking and legs, and created, if you like, this multi-level structure. But we also realised that we had to sort of assimilate the feeling of a wood. So the cast were told from the very start of rehearsals to save all the dead leaves from the autumn.
Right. Okay.
So literally, people.
Yes.
So people
Bring
actually were having big black plastic bags of dead leaves, which we brought along to the theatre a couple of days before dress rehearsal, so during the setup, and we started sort of throwing those around the floor. However, we also had to have height, and so John created a tower for Rapunzel's tower, which is quite amazing, which is about 12-15 feet high from the top deck and down to the bottom. But also one of the fondest memories is Paul here dragging a 12-foot tree basically through the streets of Catford.
Wow.
just so happened that there was some tree felling in an adjacent garden, and I thought, well, convenient. Going to come.
That was convenient. So he was dragging it through the Catford Broadway across the traffic lights.
I don't think anything surprises anyone on the streets of Catford.
So what was that? And then at the same time, we had been sort of clearing our garden, and we had so much ivy which had sort of taken over our garden. So we stripped all that as well into plastic bags, and all this was brought down to the theatre. And of course, we also had to have in front of each rise for each level a space. So we put sort of webbing in front of that and interleaved leaves and branches, you name it, everything. And the whole thing was to create this wonder magic world, which, as Sheila said, was absolutely stunning. So as the audience walked through that little glade, which also we created with leaves and branches and what have you, then they perceived this amazing sort of grotto, this incredible structure of the woods, and it was just magical to perform in.
And I suppose then the question is, how did you manage to keep it? Did it keep its freshness?
That's an interesting thought. Yes, we had backups.
Right, spare branches.
We had spare branches. Yes, it had spare branches. But generally, actually, it lasted quite well. We also there was a little secret hidey holes where aspects were key critical to the plot, like sort of magic events happening, like the dress appearing and Milky White, the cow appearing. They were secreted, if you like. They were hidden from view, but they were within the structure of this set, so behind a tree or down a gap or somewhere.
But also at the back, wasn't there? There was the ramp coming up as well, which you then appeared at the top of the set, which was quite stunning.
There were so many things which made it work.
And you know, people listening to this, a lot of people who will be listening to this have never put on a production. They may have been in one, or they've certainly seen a lot of productions, but obviously there's the famous or the infamous aspect when you finish a show of the get out, when you have to clear the space quite quickly.
Yes.
How easy was that with basically Catford Common in the studio?
The first half an hour of the strike had to basically to sort of pull away all of the greenery. Some of which was quite brown at the end, to be fair. And then it was the matter of deconstructing the steel decks, which had to be just prepared for collection on the following Monday. But I think the greenery, we tried to get people to take away as much as possible with them.
We actually, a man and his truck came along.
You're right.
A very nice
I'd forgotten
Polish
that.
man
Yes,
came
we
along
did. I paid him
at
60 quid or something,
and we loaded the truck.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we had to. The flats for the tower and everything had to go because we couldn't store them anymore.
That's right.
So we did actually get all that out.
I have to say that's the third production of Into the Woods I've been in, and it was the most creative and magical in terms of the whole experience. It was superb.
In fact, wonderful segue, Chris, as well, because you know we know that there's an awful lot that goes into the show apart from that. You know, with the actors and performers and the director's guidance, etc., and the set and everything else. We'd
found out that CDOS up in the city had done Into the Woods.
That's right.
So Sheila and I went up there and basically spent a lovely time with their staff, going through their amazing props and costume stores, and sought a lot of the costumes and special props like Milky White and that sort of thing. But Paul, showed his dressmaking skills to the fore as ever. The start of a long relationship, fantastically.
It was a few of the quilts for when the wolf and the grandmother appear.
And how did you? Because I remember the cow making noises. And things. How did that happen? Because it was
I was playing two roles, Milky White and the steward, and what we had was a small Bluetooth speaker that was actually placed inside near the stomach of the cow, and the sound effects were relayed directly there. Again, I think there were speakers under the audience's seats and in other areas as well.
Yeah, the baby had a speaker.
That's
as well.
right. Yeah.
So when she was carrying the baby in the shawl, there was a speaker secreted inside there, wasn't there, as well? Once again, to give this whole very similitude consistently.
And Paul, so you mentioned, playing two parts in this. Sheila, that sort of brings me on to the question of how do you cast? How do you go about casting such a complex show as this?
We always have an audition process with audition pieces. This was a very popular show, and one as often that you can cast more than once. The final cast comes around as really like a jigsaw, making sure that all the characters look as though they fit together, that they vocally will work together from the musical director's point of view, that the relative ages look right.
Is it about checks clearing as well, Sheila? It's all about
and you're supposed to have two handsome princes. We were very lucky that George Torman and Adrian Morrissey came along and fulfilled that role and looked extremely dashing in purpose-made costumes for them, which were made by Josie Simpson. So all our little connections in the area, sort of, people have the skills that they can come in and help with various emergencies. Yes, and it's one of those deciding how and when to double roles. As Paul said, he sort of doubled. Mark Slaughter played the wolf and also Cinderella's father. There's traditionally different ways that you can do some of the doubling. Jo Begley was Cinderella's mother and the grandmother, so going from elegant beauty to one of Jo's fantastic character performances in the wink of an eye.
Yeah.
But we did have a bit of a problem just 2 weeks maybe before the show. Scott James, who was playing Jack, was studying at the time at Musical Theatre College and discovered that he had to be at the college for some of his end of term showpieces, which was a bit of a blow because Stephen Sondheim isn't easy, and particularly Into the Woods, it's very complex musically. So we went round all the societies that performed it recently to see if somebody could come in and take over a couple of the performances of Jack, and nobody was available, and it was getting somewhat desperate. So I think my knees might be a little bit sore at the time from begging a certain Daniel Lawrence if he would actually come along. And I think he says something like, well, that's a tall ask, come back to me if you can't find anybody else, which was what I did. Maybe Daniel can take up that story.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the words Daniel and desperate Sheila usually go in the same sentence, so I suppose you're welcome. So I mean, what do you? It's funny, isn't it, Daniel? Because when we always say that, when you're performing and it's a combination of everything, and months of rehearsals and learning of lines and learning of movement and learning of the complex harmonies, particularly for Sondheim. So what happens when you get 10, 11, 12 days notice for you to go on and do a couple of performances?
Panic.
Okay.
We talked about doing it in several ways, didn't we? In the sense that originally when asking, so by the time I said yes, we had 10 days till opening. And obviously with all these endeavours, they are semi-pro and amateur combined. There's nothing amateur in the way going forward. I'd say the only thing is amateur is the budget, because you don't get big checks. But the what we considered originally was that I was going to try it with the book to try and learn the part, because Jack is wordy, to say the least, particularly Giants in the Sky. Also, I don't think I convinced terribly as a teenager, but when needs must.
Suspension of disbelief, I think.
And it's all
dark, very dark lighting.
And let it never be said, Daniel, that you don't have a face for podcasts.
No. And
great face for radio.
And so we tried the first rehearsal on this. Now, they were praising the glorious set. I can tell you I was swearing at the set within 10 minutes of being in there, because trying to walk up and down blocks that go up to 6 foot with a book in your hand doesn't help. Because we couldn't do like some operas do, where the lead might be off and somebody sings it from the wings, and you have somebody move the set, because Scott, sadly, fortunately, wasn't physically present, wouldn't be present for opening night. So I just had to do my best learning it, and there were some very late nights just mastering Giants in the Sky. I think just getting that down pat.
And funnily enough, because I mean, I suppose it's the fact that you've only had 10 days or so to learn it is challenging enough. But as a part of Jack, is in terms of the part of it, what is it about that role that is a challenge to do?
Well, I think what was quite nice about it was having two people do the production. You got two very different interpretations from what Scott and I both individually brought to the role, and so you have areas of, is he more vulnerable, is he more naive, is he more just a little bit more dense? It depends on what you wish to take from his part, particularly when you're going into No One Is Alone and you have the baker singing to him. How does Jack respond to that? Is he how emotionally moved by it is he upset? Obviously he's just lost his mother, so that's going to be devastating, but what kind of comfort does he seek from that? And I think, funnily enough, doing it on the fly, which is what you had to do for some of it because we couldn't cover everything, moments like that became far more natural in reaction. You just had to kind of be present, as they like to say. So it's a gut response. So actually what was incredible was how raw that number in particular, and Jack doesn't contribute massively in that number because it's between Cinderella and the baker, but the impact of being the focus of that number was quite brutal in terms of not being prepared. So you get that sense of over-rehearsed. This couldn't be rehearsed at all.
So it almost makes the truth a little easier to find because it's the rawness of how you're doing it. It makes it a little...
That and sheer panic of, oh God, don't look at me, I know what's coming up next.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say also that it probably helped because you knew everyone there anyway. Previously,
it was a company show,
very much so. Yes.
Everyone was there, so everyone was supportive with Scott and where he needed to be, and then helping me around where I needed to be. I mean, at one point, literally physically. So in Your Fault, which was another, really easy Sondheim lyric to learn, Walk in the Park. Somebody like Annalise Webb, who was phenomenal as Little Red, literally guided me around where I needed to be at certain points because the sheer focus at that point had to be music and lyric because everyone you came off and on one another. And so, but funnily enough, that then helped because you had, in her instance, a character then taking control of Jack. So Jack, looking completely lost at such an awful moment, was so perfectly and intentionally done.
So it's funny then, I suppose, isn't it, really? I suppose then it just goes to show that, if you put your mind to it, anything's possible, and in a short period of time that there's certainly no excuse for the rest of us not to learn our lines during the rehearsal period and to be off.
No, I did get sworn at by one cast member going, you're showing us all effing up, can you please stop?
Well, there are many cast members I know personally who would probably use that expletive, so I don't know, I can't narrow that down. So talking of that parts in it, so Chris, you played the mystery man, which is an interesting part in the show because I know I've read interpretations that the mystery man kind of stands as the parent we don't know or the parent we'd like to know more about,
or if not handled carefully, the flasher in the woods.
Or the flasher in the woods. Yeah, exactly. So I suppose my question is sort of how did you approach that, because it's not a 2D character, but it's open for interpretation, isn't it? Really?
Yes, I mean at the end of the day, given the plot, it's a very minor character until the very last scene with the baker, when there's that sort of understanding that the father and son is a very important aspect of the whole piece of the relationship.
And just to interrupt, what's for those that may not have seen it on stage but know the film, is surprisingly they cut it from the film. They basically cut virtually the whole character from the film from one sequence. Yeah, Simon Russell Beale turns up.
What a waste of Simon Russell Beale to turn up for about 10 seconds, So he turned up and took his money and ran. But he's had a lovely duet with the baker at the end of the show.
It's nice for you playing the part because you get to be the surprise that it's the bit people went, I don't know this bit in the film.
Exactly. Yes, and it's also the makeup was fun because in the dressing room every night I was sitting next to Adrian, and he sprayed my hair and backcombed my hair so it's sitting up about almost 9 inches and interlaced it with leaves. because we'd hired this amazing coat from CDOS, which was basically a little brown wrap over his cloak with leaves all over it and bright all over it. And so basically, top to bottom, I was like a tree.
Yeah.
And it was, and I'd grown a full beard as well, so the whole thing was quite sort of, quite impactful. Rustic, I think, is a good word, yes. But yeah, it was great fun to do. Yeah. And although it was a very small part to play, it was still very much integral to the piece.
There are no small parts in theatre, Chris.
Only small players, this is very true.
Absolutely right, yes. We have to point out that yet again, Chris was the father of Ben Essenhigh. They have had this little relationship quite a few times in the shows.
Ben is my other son.
And Sheila, I know we don't have the luxury of having the MD or the choreographer with us today, so here, prepare for the questions directed to you. But so
5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah, go Sheila, go. For listeners, you won't be able to see that Sheila is now actually doing a full-on part of array as we're doing this. So Sondheim is seen as particularly complex musically, and sometimes more than others. But does that play a part in how you and the choreographer artistically decide how you're going to do it? Because obviously it's difficult, so you don't want to make it really complicated for everybody, on top of the fact that you've got all those levels and everything else.
The music is always a challenge. Paul Harrison always has really high expectations of his cast. They need to do their homework and learn their harmonies, and you hope by the time that you're beginning to stage it that the music is in there. But I think if Caroline Essenhigh, the choreographer, would tell you that before we had the platforms in rehearsal, she'd got all her choreography. There isn't a huge amount of choreography, but there is this travelling through the woods that has to be achieved, and she'd got lots of wonderful patterns. And then as soon as we put all the platforms out, she went back to the drawing board and literally started all over again. So actually the movement that she put into it was really appropriate, not only for the story but for the difficulties of being on so many different platforms. And you've already mentioned obviously musically that Paul is just about visible to the cast, but because he's meticulous, I think everybody in the cast is very aware of all the tempi and the
I think it's fair to state that the cast, once it hit and gone past the band call or the dress rehearsal, didn't actually look at Paul at all. He was at 90 degrees to us. The other shows he's been behind us, above us. So basically it's been drummed into us so well, and the music is so demanding that you have to have been fully committed to it. By the time you get to performance level, you just go.
And I suppose the question to the cast members as well is that, sometimes very particular with how he writes certain lyrics and music to help aid the characterization of the people within the piece. Does that help? Does that give you the very different tempos and so forth for Jack?
Well, it does. I think the thing we were saying about doing it, also what becomes clear when doing it in 10 days is that obviously actors and performers have different strengths. Movement is not one of mine. I move like a tree, and which is quite appropriate for Into the Woods. Yeah. And Caroline, what she did try and do was give some movement, particularly on the end of like the prologue with to see, to sell, to get, to bring, to make, which had individual hand gestures. Let's just say some of us were more successful than others. I think I did sign language for most of mine, but that's another demand on the performers, particularly with Sondheim. If you're wanting some kind of unified movement, in a small space, there's no escaping. You can't hide. So you need to know absolutely everything from word to hand refrain.
You can't take liberties with it at all.
No,
it has to be. I mean, it's prescribed. It's perfect the way it's written. It's never been changed. No. That's the way you do it.
And in a small space like that, where you can see the whites of the eyes of the audience, they will spot if you're missing something.
That's a very good point, actually, Daniel. The studio is an intimate theatre setting, and therefore the audience is with you, like they're 2 feet away from you. For some of the numbers, especially when you have this amount of set, so you have to be totally on top of it, because they'll see straight away.
And I think with Sondheim, regardless, you need to be, otherwise it is the equivalent of a car pile-up. I mean, I can recall a professional production of company that I will not mention.
No, but it was in the north, I think.
Yeah, it was in the north.
It's where they play the snooker, I think.
And the opening of company, the performance we saw, they one of them missed their introduction for the very opening with Bobby, and you could see the fear etch across their face, trying to find where they were.
And they didn't, really.
They did an admirable job.
It's a hard number to catch up with, though, isn't it?
But it's the same with Into the Woods, with many of the numbers, and so that shows that you need not only, and this was an interesting thing as well, I think, having done it on such a microcosmic level, is that you need to not know only your part, you need to know everyone else's. So if somebody does, as we all do, have a brain fart and forget your line, that you can still come in regardless. You're not waiting for theirs.
And Paul, as it was your first time with Artform, a time that has now been repeated many times. Well, to great success with the latest production of your assistant direction on Elephant Man, which was to great acclaim. How did you find that as a local or group, as a local company, to be involved? Were they all welcoming? Was it was Sheila useful? Was she a hindrance?
As Daniel was saying as well, it was an ensemble piece, and also the rehearsal period was so important in this. It's so useful to have the staging laid out, but it was just such an easy way for us to do this piece as well. With the rehearsals, great ensemble piece.
And do you? I suppose open to everybody this question, because obviously your narrator was American. So was there a decision within the creative process that you were going to what accents you were going to choose, or because it's a fantasy land, it doesn't matter? Was that a decision?
I'd love to say mine was an artistic choice, but I don't think that really. You got what you got.
It was interesting. Nathan Polpater came along, and he was new to Artform. Wonderful singing voice, and he gave a couple of extremely good auditions, but I could see there would be an issue, or I felt there might be an issue, having one of the characters American and then having to change everybody. So in making him the narrator, it seemed like the natural place for him to sit. He told the story in his natural voice, and everybody else just used their natural voices, and I think it just helped people to find the truth in their characters. The studio, with the audience being so close, and everybody's talked about how the diction and knowing the words is really important, but that's because you need to get to the next level of portraying the emotion of the scene so that the audience really connect. And that's why I love doing the studio productions, because that gives you the best opportunity for that.
Well, it's McKellen who says, isn't it, that now he will never do performances in theatres that are not small, because he likes being close to people rather than shouting in a wig from the back of the to get to the back of the theatre.
And just in terms of asking from performer to director, in the sense that with something like Sondheim, I think maybe the answer is, for most, they would choose a particular one they know. But what carries you more, music or lyric, in terms of when directing or aiding an actor, and particularly if the two are going, with Sondheim as he often does, in different direction with what the lyric and the music might be doing?
Gosh, that's a very involved question, isn't it? Yeah.
Comes from being in it.
Of course.
It's all coming out now, Sheila.
Yeah. I've got my bullets in my belt.
It's got to be a match between the two. How people find it, for them it might be the music is the starting point for them, and then the lyrics help them to articulate that. But for some, the lyrics are so clever, and because Sondheim does lyrics and music, of course, he's developing them together, that sometimes the lyrics might be the thing that give you your character. It might be to do with the choice of consonants that he's got to get across a certain part of your character, or it might be that he's made that bit very lyrical, both in the choice of words and the music.
It's very interesting, because the first thing you hear generally is a melody. Not always for Sondheim, but generally that's what initially resonates. But then you realise that every single word is key critical. It's not a wasted word anywhere in any of his lyrics, and most of them are plot development as well. So it's very hard to differentiate between the importance of each, because it's like the parts are threading the whole, or vice versa, whichever it is.
And is there, when approaching it production-wise, was one act easier than the other? Because with Into the Woods, people often talk about how it's almost two shows in one, because you have the fairy tales, and you could almost, if you want the happy ending, finish the show as a one-act piece. So did you approach the two acts differently with a through line, or?
I think you have to look at the two differently because everybody has arrived at a different place by the opening of Act 2. I think the fact that we physically changed the set too helped with that.
How did the set physically
We
change?
changed the pathways for the falling down of the forest when the giant arrives. So we preempted that, and some of the pathways were blocked. Some of the decisions then had to be different. But it's in Act 2 where the truth comes out about the people and their characters and the decisions they make. So in a way, you've got to be on it in Act 2 in order to find the slightly more innocence of Act 1.
Working backwards almost.
Yes, yeah.
Sometimes interesting, isn't it? Because Sondheim is infamous for almost having a second act problem sometimes with certain shows. Sunday in the Park with George is a really good example. Yeah. The second act is odd, difficult and weird. And as you say, Daniel, sometimes they can be seen as two separate pieces. So it's interesting how you tackle that.
Well, that's why William Finn famously likes only doing one act pieces, because he says the hardest part writing the show is the opening and the closing, so why would you want to do that twice?
So I suppose, just a couple of questions to sort of close to finish and open to everybody. What would you have done differently if you were going to do it again, and what would you have avoided?
I would know the words for the prologue.
Fair enough. Anybody else?
Because when you're that close, you can't really get away with Into the Woods. But thank God I was with a cow, because I literally put my head into the cow, looking like I was having a very close relationship.
There is no way to talk about some of the cast members.
In fact, it was a crutch height, which did raise some very questionable points.
When I direct something, however you start off, you have to make a lot of decisions before you've even begun rehearsals. And there's always the midnight oil and the chewing of the fingers. Have I made the right decision? Have I made the right choices here?
Cast the right person.
Made, got the right
Sometimes you don't
set.
have a choice.
But by the time you get to the end, I'm always in love with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody's work has gone into it. The relationships of the characters are developed. People have developed their parts to such a degree that you can't imagine the piece any other way. The only thing which we would be lovely to improve at the studio is the fact that we don't have any amplification, which I think is a good thing, because I think in that space it shouldn't be necessary. And I think it makes people use their talents and skills and their technique in order to get across what they're singing and saying. But it is difficult with a live orchestra to balance it. So there's always the moments when you go, oh, just needed that to be a little bit more balanced. So if I have any regrets, it's that we're powerless to do anything about that. We can't change it, but it's one of the few.
Paul, Chris,
regrets.
anything you would?
Not really, no. I think we had the benefit of a superb cast throughout. And I think that's one of the strengths of Artform, is that because we're a production company, there's not a regular membership. You do have that opportunity to cast people who not necessarily you wouldn't think necessarily within that group, and that's one of our strengths.
One little anecdote: a friend who came to see it, because obviously the movie was released that year. In fact, the cast had all gone to see the movie.
The Beckenham Odeon,
I say movie. That's very American.
Okay.
We went to Beckenham to see the film,
Yeah.
and a friend who was in the audience said to me afterwards, she said, "I enjoyed that far more than the film, and your witch, who was Jane Kerfoot, was much better than Meryl Streep." She said, "I preferred her," which I thought was,
So Jane Kerford for Mamma Mia 3 then.
Absolutely. So,
And I suppose then a question again to everybody, sort of to close off. What advice would you give to a company who wanted to stage Into the Woods, who was going to tackle it, who might be listening to this and going, you know what, after COVID we're going to try and do Into the Woods? What advice would you give for them to do that and tackle it?
Just trust yourself as a unit and a team, because this isn't a show for obviously you have parts like The Witch and Cinderella on the Steps of the Palace, which we were very fortunate with Ros Kilpack, but it really is a team effort and trust that. It really is a good example of no part is too small. So even down to things like the ugly stepsisters and the stepmother played by Elaine, Sarah Chapman and Sarah Leanne Howe, who were hysterical in the parts. And their comedy comes from actually being behind the action. But you have to trust every single person within your team, and without sounding like a Coke advert, you can't get through those numbers unless you're all on the same plane.
I think you're right. I think in this show, everyone has to blend, everyone has to sort of work well together, has to physically look right together, vocally seem right together. So there's a lot of preparation has to be done before the cast is finalised, because then you've got a commitment to work together, and that's fantastic.
We also need, and it needs to work, you need to trust each other as pairings as well, because, for example, the baker and the baker's wife, and that was a beautiful pairing with Sarah Delaney as well. I think it just was fortunate in each aspect, but also we're fortunate that we know each other on a personal level as well, and sometimes those personal stories help inform your choices on stage.
Actually, we lost our Rapunzel in the first few weeks of rehearsal.
We did, that's true, yes.
And that was another moment. And then Kat Venard came along and was glorious, and also did a great job doubling as the witch for the transformation scene, if you remember.
Yes. Which is always an interesting one, isn't it, Sheila? Because there's with productions that how to do that transformation, whether you use a body double, whether you do very clever prosthetics, whether you use a trapdoor, which they did the original production with Bernadette Peters. So how do you do that? You
do need a body double for that last little scene, and Jane had to dash backstage, get rid of all her witch makeup and hair, and 2 minutes later appeared glamorous and gorgeous, while Kat was doing a great job acting as Jane, as the witch.
Because it's James Lapine, isn't it, who says that when it was Bernadette Peters doing it, that it was half the job was done for them, because the audience were, a lot of homosexuals were all sitting there absolutely desperate to see Bernadette Peters come out in a full glamorous wig, so the transformation wasn't difficult because everybody went nuts because it was Bernadette Peters.
Vanessa Williams in the revival, which eventually won it the Tony on Broadway, so it won the Tony for Best Revival. Again, when you've got somebody as beautiful as Vanessa Williams, actually she doesn't have to do much.
Well, it's bigger name as well when everybody's waiting for the name above the marquee like Bernadette Peters or Vanessa Williams to come and to be the part. Well, thank you everybody, and just a couple of a note, because obviously during COVID we're recording this outside, so we certainly had social distancing, so we certainly had an aeroplane go across and some noise, so the background there will be for that. But thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again for another afternoon with Artform, where we will discuss another production and how it all went down. Lovely. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you very much.
Content copyright Artform 2020.